The Transparency Task Force is an international community. It has about 2,750 members of it. And what unites us is the idea that we want the financial services system to be better. Our mission is to promote ongoing reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. And we think that's a really important mission. We think the financial system is profoundly important to the well-being of society, but we also believe there's a lot wrong with it. But everything that is wrong with it is fixable. We do not think that our work is futile. We think that what is wrong can be sorted out. We are much, much more than just a talk shop. In all honesty, if all we did was talk about stuff, I'd give this up straight away and go back and treble my income by doing what I used to do. The reason I'm happy to do what I do, despite the sacrifices along the way, is because I believe we can and perhaps even are making a difference. And that's what we're all about. We're all about making a difference. And to help us with that, we have a strategy or an idea. And our strategy for driving change is to bring together the thinking of two groups of people. On one hand, there are people like me and the people on this session tonight and the people in our community who we characterize as having a sense of passion and purpose for the change that we want to see. That's what characterizes us. We have a sense of passion and purpose for the change that we want to see. There's another group, however, who are also very, very important. These are individuals who have the power and the position to make change possible. So the Transparency Task Force is an attempt to create opportunities to bring together the thinking of these two important groups of people. One cannot work without the other. It's the combination that makes a difference. So I'm going to share my screen and show you an example of the sort of thing that we have been working very, very hard to do with, frankly, very little resource to make a difference. So what you're looking at right now, ladies and gentlemen, is a website that we built. It's the website of the APPG, that's the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Pension Scams. For those of you that don't know, there is a huge problem in the UK right now where pension savers are being duped or tricked, conned, frauded into having their pensions stolen away by crooks. It's a massive problem. So we've been very tuned into this issue for several years. We've worked very hard to actually get an inquiry opened. Right now in the UK government, there is an inquiry about pension scams that we, little old Transparency Task Force with no power and no resource, managed to get opened, and we're proud of that. We're also proud of the APPG because we've managed to recruit into this all-party parliamentary group lots and lots of politicians, and some of them are pretty significant folk. For example, well, there's the chair, Bob Blackman, who's a Conservative MP. For those of you that don't know, an APPG, an all-party parliamentary group, is where politicians from right across the political spectrum agree to work together to get stuff done. It's a lovely concept. It's a lovely context. This gentleman here, Stephen Timms MP, he's important to us because he's the chair of the Work and Pension Select Committee. He's a Labour MP, but he chairs an all-party group and he's involved with this all-party parliamentary group. Another gentleman that I'll point out, although there are several important people here, is this gentleman, Jack Dromey. Jack Dromey, another Labour Party politician, is the shadow minister for pensions, a man who, again, has potential to be quite significant to us moving forward. And there are more, and there are more. I won't dwell on this, but all I'm saying is, here's a real live example of what we've done to bring together politicians who, as I said earlier, are part of the equation that have the power and the position to make change happen. Behind the politicians, we have our secretariat. Now, all of these people are Transparency Task Force members and volunteers who have stepped forward to work alongside me in running this all-party parliamentary group. And it's a lovely dynamic. We're doing it because we want to do it. We're not earning a penny out of doing it, but it needs to be done. And we are absolutely committed to trying to make a difference. And I'm making the point that We do know how, we have learned how over the last 5.5 years to find ways to bring people together to make a difference. Now, interestingly, we're actually now the secretariat to a second all-party parliamentary group. We haven't got a website for it yet. This has only happened a couple of weeks ago. We are also now the secretariat to the all-party parliamentary group for personal banking and fairer financial services. I won't dwell on that. It's happening, it's done. The third one that we want to work on is around financial stability and the money system. And that is very significant because it dovetails perfectly into what we're going to do tonight. What I'm going to do is show you a document that I think I should be able to get to. Yep, I can. Now, some of you will remember the event we ran about the global financial crisis. We ran an event exactly 10 years to the day after the global financial crisis happened in the UK. It was 10 years to the day after Northern Rock collapsed. And that was a very dark moment in British history, one of our banks collapsing. So we had an event about what we could do to mitigate the risk of something like that happening again. Off the back of the event, we produced this paper, Ideas to Help Reduce the Chance of Another Global Financial Crisis. We started off with, I think, 6 volunteers who were 3 speakers at the event I'm talking about, plus 3 of the audience. We worked together. The more work we did on it, the better it got. In fact, it got so good, I was able to basically talk people in Parliament into letting us present it at the House of Commons. And we presented it to people from the Bank of England. I'm very pleased to see Michael Kumhoff from the Bank of England is with us this evening. We presented it to people from the Financial Conduct Authority. We presented it to people from all kinds of regulatory powers. And it was a fascinating piece of work. And the intent then was to use this report and the meeting in Parliament as a springboard to create our first all-party parliamentary group. But then Brexit started happening, and the dynamic wasn't right for people working collaboratively in Parliament. So it all got put on the back shelf. But believe you me, as soon as our second all-party parliamentary group is settled into place nicely, which is the one on personal banking and fairer financial services, we are going to be going straight to getting this up and running. Why? The reason is, and believe me, those of you who know me know what I'm about to say to be true. I'm not in any way technically minded or academically minded. It sometimes takes me time to really pick up on stuff and understand it properly. But I can honestly tell you this. I've had so many conversations with so many good people over the recent years to absolutely convince me that many of the root causes of many of the problems that we have in society in terms of the financial ecosystem, the root cause is a money supply that kind of seems to be out of control. In my very simple plain English, the way I see it is we have a banking system that is very highly motivated because it's so profitable to create debt. We have a society that is drowning in debt with all sorts of financial, emotional, societal problems as a consequence. So that's why we are going to work hard to create an all-party parliamentary group about financial stability or the money supply. We haven't really settled up on the name yet. Now, in this document, I think it's on page 10, it makes reference to some work that the Bank of England did about basically confirming the way the money system works. And what it says here, and it's in the Money Creation in the Modern Economy Bank of England Quarterly Bulletin, Q1 2014. Alexandra, my colleague, will make sure that everybody knows how to get to this document if you want to read it. What it basically says is banks create money from nowhere. It's not about people depositing money in the banks and that money then being lent to others. That's how I grew up thinking the money system works. I believe a lot of people think it's that way, but it's absolutely wrong. And when the Bank of England says it's wrong, you've got a pretty credible source there. So I'm making this point because we believe there's a huge re-education job to do. So I'm now going to show you something else very, very briefly, and Professor Keane will be speaking in about 4 minutes time. The second thing I'm going to show you, the next thing I'm going to show you is about our groups. Now, the Transparency Task Force, despite the fact we've got no resource, no power, no nothing, just effort, we've managed to create 20 different groups. One of them is quite new. It's our Academics for Fairer Finance group. We're bringing together academics from around the world. I think we've got 350 so far. I'm really proud of that. I'm really proud of that. Our efforts are being taken serious enough for people like the professors, plural, 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 that we have this evening. We got people from all over the world, from Stanford, from Harvard, from Cambridge, and from many, many leading universities around the world. And our project regarding Academics for Fairer Finance is to work collaboratively to find ways to reorient business colleges, business schools, and universities to teach a syllabus that makes sense. Too many people, too many youngsters are coming out of university pre-programmed, thinking that all that matters is short-term profit. They are being conditioned, indoctrinated, miseducated. The more I understand this, the more I'm convinced it's the root cause of so many problems. And frankly, when I'm feeling pretty skeptical, I sometimes wonder if the banking system has even infiltrated the world of academia and found ways to financially support the kind of courses and syllabuses that they want to. And we then end up with this horrible, vicious cycle. You know, great people going to university with a great mindset, coming out feeling that short-term profit is all that really matters, when of course, all the empirical evidence is telling us we are painting ourselves into a corner if we carry on this way. Now, I really do hope I've set the scene and I've explained to you why this event matters. This event matters because probably only once in my lifetime, I'm 55, only once in my lifetime will I be around when a massive opportunity arises. And somebody taught me something recently called the Overton window. I had to look it up afterwards to read about it, to basically check I really understood it. But what he basically said to me was, the Overton window is an idea, and forgive my non-academic way of explaining it, forgive that. What he basically said was, the Overton window is when circumstances change and ideas that once upon a time would have been thought of as too stupid to even consider, not even worthy of consideration, would actually, because of a change in circumstances, become worth thinking about, worth contemplating. And I believe it might well be that this Overton window thing, right, is a good way of describing how COVID and the many, many horrific aspects of COVID might just create some changes in society that could actually be triggers for real progress, real progress. And that's why this event is important, because wrapped up in all of that is the idea of a private debt jubilee. I first heard that phrase when I watched one of Professor Steve Keen's many, many YouTube videos. I've watched, I think, a dozen of them in the last 6 months or so, because I find Professor Keen's work fascinating. By the way, I've also spent huge amounts of time watching the YouTube videos of Professor Michael Hudson. And just a couple of days ago, one of our other speakers, Richard Wilkinson as well. There's some brilliant stuff out there. It's all progressive, it's creative, it's solution orientated. It comes from a place of justice and fairness. It doesn't come from a place of capitalism as bad, by the way. I'm a capitalist, yeah? I'm a conscious capitalist. I do not see any tension between profit and principles. I think you can have both. I think we should be having both. We want kids coming out of universities knowing that, yes, go and make yourself an absolute fortune. Give away as much of it as you can afford. Do something decent, but don't feel bad about money. Don't feel bad about commercial sense, but use your success as a platform to drive change. So that's where we're coming from. I'm so looking forward to listening to what Professor Keane has to say. Just before we pass over to Professor Steve Keane, my colleague Alexandra, who's worked very hard putting this event together for us all, is going to deal with a couple of housekeeping notes, and then we're over to Steve. Alexandra, please deal with your couple of points. Thank you very much.
Hi, evening everyone. Just to let you know that we are recording this session, and we will be uploading it to our YouTube channel in due course. But if there's anything you regret saying and you'd want us to edit it out, please just send me an email to make sure we don't include it. I'll put my email address in the chat. Speaking of the chat, obviously after the event, I'll circulate the chat, minus any private messages you send to me or Andy. So feel free to put your contact details in there and any comments you want during the event. It's always interesting conversation. And lastly, we'd really appreciate it if you can help us if you have the time to tweet during the event, and I'll put our Twitter handle also in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Thanks for putting this event together. I'm really looking forward to hearing our speakers. You've got Professor Steve Keane, then Professor Michael Hudson, then Professor Richard Wilkinson, three stellar speakers who really know their subject inside out, back to front. Please learn from this, learn from each other. Please also take the opportunity to ask questions and make comments. We're all about doing stuff together. We believe that collectively we're more impactful than doing things on our own. Professor Steve Keane, if you haven't already, please unmute yourself and go for it. Thank you very much. Professor Keane has about 20 minutes speaking, maybe 10 minutes for Q&A. Over to you, Steve. Thank you very much for being with us, especially as it's something like where you are right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, and you know, I really admire the work you're doing as well. By the way, I have to say that you're a firebrand and a viable and a great motivator. So I didn't have as much work than I normally do to make a presentation because circumstances intervened today, and I had about 5 hours less than I thought I'd have. It was fun, so pardon me. There'll be less detail and more speed than I'd like to normally have here. But I thought I'd put the spin from the days when Keynes wrote a paper called How to Pay for War. And what we're really going through, I think, is something on the same scale as a war. And so it was made it How to Pay for the Virus. And the perspective of both Michael Hudson and Michael Kumoff. Hi, Michael, glad to see you in absent, invisible there, but good to have you about. Ed and a few others, I'm very happy to see you here too, by the way. Hey, Michael, good mate, good to see you. So what we have is a global phenomenon of an enormous level of private debt, which is ignored by policymakers who obsess about the level of government debt. So this is looking at the situation for the United States, going back pretty much as far back as private debt data goes, and not quite as far as government debt goes. You can see that at the moment, there's a huge spike in government debt going on, and that's obviously COVID, which is driving that. There's also a spike in private debt, but it's pretty bloody obvious which one is bigger. Now, why is it that the mainstream economists obsess about this one and don't worry about that? It's because they've got a child's version of a model of money creation, and that's why the paper that Andy mentioned by the Bank of England is so important, because for over half a century, people like myself and Michael Hudson and some of our predecessors in non-orthodox economics have been saying it's private debt that matters. That's the dominant problem. And we've been ignored by the mainstream, which has a model of private debt being savers lending money to borrowers and banks just being intermediaries. I call that the Ashley Madison theory of banking, which I think some people here are old enough to know what the joke is. Now, since 1956, private debt has been higher than government debt in America. So it gives you an idea of just how long this elephant in the room has been ignored. But the issue we have at the moment now is how to pay for this, which is the increase in government debt caused by COVID. And I just want to make the point that's showing you American data. There, of course, most of Andy's activists at the moment are UK. So the UK is in a similar situation. UK private debt is, even with the increase after the global financial crisis in government debt, private debt is far higher, and private debt has actually tripled as a percentage of GDP, more than tripled between 1980 and 2010. It's then come down since then, but that's still, to me, to Michael Hudson, to Michael Kumoff, and the band of contrarian economists who focus upon credit and private debt, That's the major issue. But, and again, since 1980, in the UK, private debt has been bigger. We've been ignoring this for 40 years. Now, to phrase the question of how do we pay for the virus, well, how do we pay for the war? There's clearly an enormous increase in government debt there. I'll just go back and reverse if I can do that. Let's just see. Whoops, wrong one. Yeah, you can see government debt went from about 210% of GDP, was far higher than today, to 340% during World War II, an enormous increase in debt. So obviously we borrowed the money to pay for the war. Now, where did we borrow it from? The answer is we didn't. And I want to show what the logic is behind that. So to actually answer that question, you have to know how is money created, and to know what you create money, you've got to know what money is. Now, primarily, money is bank deposits. You can be more sophisticated than that. You can include cash, which is a fairly trivial part of the money supply. But those are the two parts of it. Now, cash, of course, is issued by the central bank. I won't worry too much about the dynamics of that, because that's a very small part of overall financing. So what really tells you what creates money is what increases deposit accounts at banks. That's the fundamental form of money these days. And of course, deposit accounts at banks are a banking sector liability. Now, if you're going to drive up the liabilities of the banking sector while keeping the whole system balanced, you also have to increase the assets. So when banks lend money, when the banks create a loan, they are creating an asset for themselves, which is the loan, and a liability for themselves, which is the money they give to the borrower, which is stored in the borrower's bank accounts or transferred to the person the borrower is buying from if you're involved in a credit card operation. So there are two primary ways you can create money. One is you can have bank loans, which are assets, creating deposits, which are liabilities. So on the asset side, you have loans. On the liability side, you have deposits. The other, and this is what modern monetary theory is emphasising today, is that government spending creates reserves on the asset side of the banks and deposits on the other side, the liabilities again. Now, when you look at this in a double entry view, you can understand what's going on. And about 10 years ago, I invented a software package called Minsky, which is after Hyman Minsky, who was the archetypical developer of non-orthodox economics from monetary analysis. So I named it in honour of Minsky. And what it enables us to have is a double entry view of the monetary system. And without that, you don't know what you're talking about. And that therefore rules out virtually every mainstream economist on the planet, except Michael Kumhof. So this is the simple way of looking at what actually is going on in money creation. And that is that when you have banks lend money, they create a loan, it's saying that lending money is a dangerous term because lending implies it's lending from something. Now, this is creating a loan and creating deposit at the same time. Okay? So that increases assets, increases liabilities. Repayment does the opposite, and therefore that destroys money and destroys assets at the same time. And if the government spends, it puts money in your bank account, and to do that, it puts money in the reserves of the banking sector. So government spending creates excess reserves, and tax reduces excess reserves. So those are the two primary ways we create money in a capitalist economy. And because mainstream economists made us terrified about this and argued that spending has to be paid back and we're burdening future generations, blah, 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 over the last 40 years, in particular, we've had an emphasis upon saying, don't let the government run a deficit, don't let it do it. What happens instead, of course, we've borrowed from private banks. So we've had, rather than having a large amount of fiat created money, which is what's going on here, money created by government fiat, we've had money created by credit. So there's too much credit money in the economy and too little fiat money because of the misunderstandings that mainstream economics has forced upon us. So when you look at the creation of money by the banking sector, when new loans exceed repayment, that creates money and debt. When you look at net government spending, when spending exceeds taxes, that creates money and excess reserves. Those are the two balancing items. Now, the private sector, from the private sector's point of view, of course, the private sector borrows to speculate on assets primarily, and banks encourage that. I'm looking just at the monetary transactions now. If I generalise that, I could include the asset bubbles and so on inside there, and that would have price dynamics, which are major confusing items of people understanding what's going on in asset markets. But the actual act of borrowing money from a bank does not change the private sector's net assets. Its assets rise in terms of its bank accounts, its liabilities rise in terms of its debt to the bank. So no net change in net assets. But when the government spends money, that increases the net assets of the private sector because their deposit accounts rise, which are their assets, but the reserves rise, which aren't related to they're not the reserves, not a liability of the private sector. So the private sector gets a positive boost over government spending. So rather than government spending burdening the private sector, it's actually enhancing the private sector by giving it a debt-free asset in that sense. So, but of course we have this mythology, and it's very emphatically believed by mainstream commentators, that the government has to raise money from the public to cover its deficit. So it's got to borrow money from the public. That's the conventional view. No, in fact, the opposite applies. The government running a deficit actually creates money for the public. We've got this thing, to use an Australian expression, I'm allowed to do that because it's about 1:30 in the morning in Thailand here, so I can use my Aussie slang. You've got it asked about tip. Yeah. Now, why does the government sell bonds in that case? What is going on when the government sell bonds? Well, it's not to borrow money from the private sector. And again, we can see this by taking this double entry bookkeeping view of the whole process, because I've now got the two operations I showed initially. That's creating money while creating matching debt. This is creating money while creating excess reserves. So if the government spends, let's say, £100 billion more than it taxes, it creates £100 billion of excess reserves for the banking sector. I'm aggregating all sorts of entities together into the banking sector. I'm including primary dealers, banks, financial institutions, a whole lot. But nonetheless, overall, the financial sector ends up with excess reserves by the creation of a government deficit. So when the government says, we'd like to sell you some bonds, that is actually an asset swap for the private sector, for the private banks. They've got £100 billion of excess reserves earning no interest, and the government says, we'll offer you £100 billion worth of bonds paying 1% or 2% interest. Would you like to hand over that cash? Now, I might accuse banks of being mad, but I'd never accuse them of not being greedy. So they're being offered to swap 100 billion earning nothing for 100 billion earning 2%. That's 2 billion a year. I'll take that ideal, thanks. So that's why you've never had an issue of government bonds that hasn't been oversubscribed. It's free money. Now, so that's what's going on with the bond sale, and what it also enables the Treasury to do is to avoid running an overdraft account with the central bank. Michael will probably clarify some of this stuff for me, because I'm not as detailed on the central bank as somebody who works inside it and knows it intimately. But fundamentally, that's the role. Okay, so you don't need the bonds to finance what the government's done. The spending finances itself. Now, when the central bank buys bonds off the private sector, and I must say, by the way, before I read Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth, which I do recommend people reading, when people ask me, does government spending create money, I would say, because I hadn't actually worked it out at that stage, I would say to the extent the central bank buys the bonds. I read Stephanie's book, and most of that's pretty much common knowledge for me, but in that section, Stephanie said, no, that's just an asset swap again. The central bank buying bonds off the banks actually reduces the assets of the bankings, it takes assets out of the banking sector, puts it in the, or gives them excess reserves again. It increases their reserves. Again, it's not creating any money. And that's true. When you look at what's going on when the central bank buys bonds off the private banks, it swaps bonds for reserves. So again, none of this is needed to finance what the government is doing. Because the government is the government, by fiat, it creates the money that it enables it to spend. So I mentioned I've put modern monetary theory together into a Minsky model. This is the Minsky model here. And of course, this is not the sort of seminar where I want to go to this in detail. It'd be just a bit too much, but to bring it up here on screen and show what's going on. I hope I better actually ask Andy, can you see that at the moment? Because
yes, we can. It's small.
A fair bit of data coming down. So what I've got here is a table showing the lending and repayment by banks, spending by governments, bond purchases and so on, interest paid on bonds, interest paid by firms for borrowing they've done from the banking sector, hiring workers, paying dividends, consumption by the various social classes. And I can run this model with the government running a surplus, deficit, pardon me, the S rate is the spending rate, at 32.5% of GDP, while the taxing is 30% of GDP. So it's running a 2.5% of GDP deficit. And what I'm looking at with Minsky here, it's possible to look at other forms of assets in Minsky, but what I'm looking here is assets as financial claims on somebody else. So when you think about your assets in terms of your financial claims on some other person, not the value of your Lamborghini parked in your driveway that you fully paid off, but your assets as claims on other people or institutions. If your assets are greater than your liabilities, you're in positive equity. The rest of the world relative to you in terms of those claims is in negative equity. The sum of all equity is zero. Okay. So when you play this through and see what happens, it turns out that because banks have to be in positive equity, the banking sector is in negative equity, we have a financial crisis because banks must lever their positive equity. If the banking sector is in positive equity, which it must be, the rest of society is in identical negative equity. And that's part of what motivates us to borrow from banks and speculate. We're trying to get away from the negative equity that by necessity we're in because we're in a monetary economy. But when the government runs a surplus like that, also deficit, pardon me, 2.5% of GDP, it's actually increasing non-government equity. So I'll just run this model with that deficit being run. And the important line to look at is the green line there, the green line being non-bank private equity. And you see the deficit is actually increasing the equity of the private sector. Now, if the government decides, oh, terrible, according to Milton Friedman, we've got to pay this back, so let's now tax, and what that taxing does is drive equity negative. So government spending is actually a way of creating equity for the private sector. Now, and looking at the scale of that during the Second World War, the scale of the increase in government debt during the Second World War was as high as 45% of GDP. This is the blue line is change in government debt measured on the right-hand axis. So it's virtually 45% of GDP per year in 39-41. Now, nobody in Parliament was saying, we can't spend that money, we've got to cut it back a bit. Okay, what was the alternative to that? It was learning German. Okay. So seeing an existential threat, that's what the amount of money the government created. How did it finance it? It created it by spending the money. Why did it spend the war bonds? Again, it was the asset swap I've shown you initially, but a lot of bonds were sold to the public. And when you look at this idea of selling war bonds to the public, I'll just go down here and just show the spending for the war itself. So very generally speaking, you want to buy weapons, you get them made by firms, you spend money on firms, they get more cash in their account, that gives them positive equity. You want to hire workers, of course you get the working class to do that, particularly in the UK. Can't have the ruling class fighting for itself. So you hire workers. So the spending, armaments and soldiers, actually boosts the government, boosts the private sector, enables you to pay for the, do the war itself. When you sell the war bonds, again, you're doing the same thing. You're letting the banks do a swap from non-income earning to income earning assets. If you sell it to the public, and here you're selling to the bonds to the capitalists, you're actually taking money out of the private sector because you don't want them buying Lamborghinis, you want the money to be used to buy tanks. So that is a way of reducing the spending of the private sector. It wasn't to finance the war, it was to stop the spending going on non-war items. That's why we had that spending. So let's apply that to COVID. If we actually, because government spending is self-financing, you don't need to borrow from the banks to do it. And what we have after the financial crisis back in 2008, because we haven't reduced the level of private debt substantially, we had a private sector which was cash flow constrained to begin with. And now, of course, COVID has made this more extreme. Many parts of the private sector have revenues that are less than their expenses. They're facing bankruptcy. And this enormous hit has happened while financial constraints have remained constant. And of course, cash flows in terms of both wages and profits are down substantially for many, many firms. A large part of the increase in debt we've seen with the private sector in America is firms simply having to borrow money to keep afloat. So we're going to have a financial crisis either during or after COVID, and we could get rid of that with what I call a modern debt jubilee. Now, the idea of a modern debt jubilee is rather than just abolishing the household debt, which is what happened in ancient times in Sumerian and in Jewish and Roman times. This would be using the government money creation capacity, which is unlimited. Okay? There's no issue in the government creating that money to make an equal per capita payment to people, whether they were in debt or not. So both debtors and savers would get the cash injection on an equal basis. Rupert Murdoch would get as much as me. I think it'd matter more to me, but you never know with Rupert. Debtors would be required to reduce their debt. Savers would be able to, and given the fact we want to stimulate spending now, we'd want some of that money to go on actual consumer spending. But I would also have a part of it being used to buy newly issued corporate shares, where those corporate share proceeds must be used to reduce corporate debt. I want to reduce both. And by doing it, you don't actually change the amount of money in the economy, but you change whether it's backed by credit or backed by fiat. We need to get to the stage that's much more fiat-based and much less credit-based. Now, a very simplified view of that, again, I'd like to have done more detail, but I lost time in the last few days, is that you can have, just showing, I've divided my private sector into debtors and savers here. So you have a payment going to debtors, which is the Jubilee D, which they've got to use to pay off their debt. The Jubilee to savers, which they can then use to buy shares, which have been issued by the finance sector and the non-financial corporate sector, so industrial firms basically, and they have to use that money to pay off their debt. That's the sort of basic view. So it's something which is quite feasible. It's an accounting operation fundamentally. It's one the government's not constrained in doing. We could do that and reduce the private burden and enable us to come out of the crisis, the COVID crisis, without a financial crisis. This is seeing the same thing from the point of view of the central bank, and this is seeing it from the point of view of the Treasury. The Treasury, because of this whole rule about, in terms of financial claims, if one group is positive, the rest is negative. If the Treasury is doing it, it's going to negative equity to enable the rest of us to go into positive equity. But nobody ever asked the government, can you finance yourself? Because it's the government, it's fiat, it's got the right to do it. So they finally end up in saying, why is this new in some ways? It's because only people like myself and the two Michaels here have actually, from an academic point of view, looked at the level of private debt and credit and worried about it. And when you take a look at the level of private debt, and this is American data going back to 1830, what you find is the major crises in capitalism have been after private debt bubbles, where there's been a reduction in private debt, which has caused negative credit, and those periods of negative credit have been the Great Recession, the Great Depression, and I didn't even know about this one until I produced this chart. This is called the Panic of 1837, and that was a substantial period of negative credit, combined with a period of very low government money, which I think was a major part of determining the American psyche, and we know how bad that's been. So the major crises in capitalism have been caused by private debt crises, by credit crises, and failing to understand that is where we've got into this trap that Andy's talking about. And the data is so overwhelmingly in favour of the case that myself and the two Michaels make here, the importance of credit and the irrelevance, relatively, of government money in terms of creating crises. Mainstream economists ignore credit because they think it has no major macroeconomic effects. That's Ben Bernanke's assumption back in when he wrote his essays on the Great Depression. This is the correlation of change in debt, which is credit, and unemployment in America. Now, I think most of us here are old enough to know what a Rorschach plot is. That looks like one. They're not unrelated to each other. One causes the other. And that's what's being ignored by the mainstream. That's what we're trying to turn the logic around. I'm very, very glad to have Andy on board helping us analyse that. And that's the end of me.
Wow. Professor Keane, thank you so, so much for sharing those thoughts with us. I always find your work really inspiring and really exciting because you you point to the possibilities of changing the way the system's working, because the system isn't working, it's failing. So we have to be different. Before I go to comments and questions from our audience, let's first of all talk about the problem here, i.e., let's imagine that a strategy along the lines of what you've just described isn't implemented, and we do have a COVID crisis becoming a financial crisis. In your opinion, Professor Keane, how bad could that crisis be? And I ask the question specifically because when we had our event about avoiding another global financial crisis, many of the economists we had at the event said, next time round it will be worse because a lot of the kind of flex in the system has already been taken up. The next crisis could actually be a lot worse than the last one. So if we did kind of fall off this cliff as a consequence of COVID, how bad could it be, and what could be the consequences of that? I want to understand the nature of the problem we are trying to avoid experiencing, because when we understand how bad the problem is, it might increase the appetite for people to think of progressive, radical solutions along the lines of what you just described. Thank you.
Okay. Well, actually, I read a book called Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis back in 2017. And my argument was we're not going to have another financial crisis because what a financial crisis normally requires is a large run-up in debt, which gives you a large part of demand, which is based on credit. So like in America's case, you got to the stage in 2007 where credit was equivalent to 15% of GDP. So a large part of aggregate demand. And Michael and I can explain, the Michaels and I can explain the logic behind that shortly. And then it goes to -5. So you had a plus 20%, you had a 20% turnaround in credit demand from plus 15 to -5. And then in the aftermath, because that scarred banks and scarred borrowers, you have had a decline in private debt, but not a substantial one. It's gone from 170% of GDP to 150 in America's case, whereas during the Great Depression went from about 140 at the beginning to 35% after the Great Depression and the Second World War. So nothing like the fall in private debt. What that meant was credit-based demand was fairly small, running at about 7% of GDP. That's where it maxed out. The last chart I showed you, it maxed out at about 7 and is now down to about 5% of GDP. So you haven't had to climb up the hill. But what you can regard COVID is somebody dug a hole in the road. Right. And you've fallen into it, okay? So rather than having to climb up and go down, we've gone crunch down into this hole. And I think everybody knows that anybody who loses their job or the company goes bankrupt because of COVID can't be blamed. Well, you should have seen this coming. No damn way. It really is it's the very first time an exogenous shock has caused an economic crisis. When the idea of exogenous shocks causing crisis is the only thing mainstream economists can come up with. So this is exogenous, nobody's fault, nobody should suffer from it, and we should therefore fill in the hole in the road created by COVID. Now, if we don't do that, what we're going to have is an enormous drop in demand, and then people have accumulated debt during the crisis. They don't have the wages, they don't have profits to cover it afterwards. If we don't do anything, we're going to have a huge slump. So rather than going the usual story from a boom to a slump, which is what back in 2007, we could go from stability to a crash. And I think that's what we face. And the more the government restrains from doing it, worrying about its own finances, the worse it's going to make the private sector finances. So I can see things like massive evictions of tenants. I can see mortgagee sales at some point, clouded by the other crazy stuff that's coming in from QE and so on. But a very substantial crisis, and pretty much when you think about it, falling in the working class. They're the ones who are going to cop the worst of this because they're the ones who've got the rents to pay they can't afford to pay.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to share my screen once again just to make one quick point, a quick but I think important point. This is the web page about our book. The bit I want to refer to is actually the picture, the painting done by the Chinese artist for us. This picture on the left, this 12-headed monster, is basically representing the angry financial services system. The picture on the right, the golden dragon, is what we want to turn it into. And the reason I want to show you these pictures is because at the bottom of the picture on the left, you'll see there are people, or more accurately, there are bodies. And to be more precise, there are 10 bodies. And the reason there are 10 bodies at the bottom of this picture is because, according to research by Oxford University, over 10,000 people killed themselves as a direct consequence of the last global financial crisis. I'll put a link to the research in the chat shortly. 10,000 people. By the way, that wasn't the world as a whole. That was UK, mainland Europe, Canada, and the USA. What happened was people lost their livelihoods, they lost their homes, they lost their families broke up. Professor Keane just commented it may well be the working classes who end up suffering most as a consequence of this. I really do hope we don't find ourselves looking back in 2, 3, 4 years' time, realizing that we crashed into the bottom of that great big hole in the middle of the road and think, why didn't we fill the damn thing in when we got a chance? Professor Keane, thank you very much. We're going to open up to questions and comments. I'm sure everybody's really enjoyed listening to you explain the whole idea of a private debt jubilee and the logical, rational science, data, evidence behind it. Please wave at me if you'd like to make a comment or a question. I think Alan Salomon wanted to make a point, so let me just go back and see if he does. Alan does.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep, excellent. Yeah, thanks very much for that presentation. It was good to see how the system works. But I have also thought quite recently, knowing that I was coming to this talk, about how this would be done, the actual practical methodology of how it would be done, how loans would be written off by banks and car salesmen and credit card companies, how the people would pay that off, what the accounting functionality would be, or the accounting impact and the people impact, and so on. Now, there's a lot of processes in that, really difficult processes. Now, as we are nowhere near getting that done, and as you've said, Professor, you're in the minority amongst economists and bankers and governments about this, then, I mean, what's your view? How long would this take, assuming people agreed with it in government tomorrow, and there's unlikely to be? How long would it take? It's not going to be anywhere near this COVID or financial crisis, is it?
Very good question. I mean, particularly people who work in the finance sector know all the sorts of covenants that are attached to loan contracts. You know that in some cases, if you try to pay a loan too early, there's a penalty for repaying the loan and so on. All sorts of legal requirements to stop you paying loans quickly, and triggers in CDOs and so on. So it's not straightforward, not easy. Perhaps the easiest system might be to have something like a central bank digital currency system as an offset account, or to enable people to have money which, rather than paying their debt down, goes into an offset account which then services their debt, something of that nature. And then so there would be a lot of very detailed legal and technical work involved, and accounting work in making something like this succeed. Of course, what do I expect to have happen? Bugger all. They'll continue listening to the Krugmans and the Mancues of the world, and we'll end up with a disaster, and I'll be sitting back saying, I told you so, which has been my lifestyle for the last 20 years.
Professor Keane, are there any governments around the world who might be more positive about this kind of idea, where if they were to apply it in their country, it could potentially prove the validity of the concept? Are you aware of any countries where this could be a goer?
The only country that I've had government contact with about this is New Zealand.
Really, that's fascinating. Okay.
Yeah, it hasn't gone very far, by the way, but it did happen.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to ideas about what we can do about this later on in the session. But in keeping with what I said earlier, folks, we aren't just a talking shop. We'll turn the essence of what's been discussed this evening into a document, into a paper. We'll get it in front of the people that we can get it in front to, and we'll do all we can just to stimulate the debate. We aren't going to say, this is right, this is wrong, do this, don't do that. What we're going to say is, let's have an intelligent, grown-up conversation about strategies to deal with the very likely economic shocks caused by COVID. Yeah. Here's one idea, what's yours? That's the way we'll approach it. Thank you very much. Let's go back to the group. Please wave at me if you'd like to make a point, please. Johnny. Hi, Johnny. Please do unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and put your point. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Johnny. I'm a novice at this sort of stuff, but I've been learning a bit about it. And so debt was a really big problem for a lot of marginalized people in the UK and everywhere, but before COVID, and Positive Money and people like that were suggesting debt jubilees, last year before, and I suppose I'm thinking, like, what's the more long-term solution after you've patched the hole? You can't do a debt. Can you do a debt jubilee every 10 years? Would that work in the modern world?
Well, you can have a rolling responsibility of the government to keep private debt from getting too high.
Yeah.
I mean, when I look at the level of private debt and see how large it was during the 50s and 60s in America, it was about 40% of GDP, okay? 40 to 60%. And if you think back to what part of the prosperity, that was called the golden age of capitalism. Now, a large part of it was because you could have a large amount of credit-based demand without causing a credit crisis or a repayment crisis for anybody. And interest rates then were as low as they are now, pretty close. So I would include monitoring government debt and private debt and making sure it didn't get too high as a major part of government policy. And therefore, yes, rolling Jubilee be a normal part of that. If you saw the private sector accumulating too much debt, you'd have another mini Jubilee to reduce the amount of credit-based money and replace it with fiat-based money.
Thank you, Professor Keane. I think Michael Kuhnoff wanted to make a point. And thanks for your question, Johnny. Great stuff. Okay, we've got time for one more before we move on to our next speaker, Michael Hudson. We have Mr. Marcus Krebs. I love saying Marcus Krebs. It's a lovely name, but I love hearing his wonderful accent as well. Marcus, great to see you. Please put your point to Professor Keane. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy, and thanks, Professor Keane. Very good presentation. Now, I've been wondering, given the lack of support you seem to have experienced by governments globally, other than maybe the New Zealanders, is there any connection or is there any conversation opener along the lines of universal basic income? Because that has been discussed around the globe. I think it was voted for last year down in Switzerland, but there's been other places where this is actively being considered. Is there any link between the two, and would that be a door opener for your idea? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Yes, it would be. The trouble is that UBI has been used by a number of governments to try to reduce their welfare payments, and at the same time, I am sympathetic to modern monetary theory. Okay, I'm not 100%, but I'm sympathetic to it. And one part I'm unsympathetic to is they are very strong about saying it should be a job guarantee instead of a universal basic income, which I think is a pity. I think I can have both. And there's some animosity between the two sides, which I find rather disappointing. So I think, yes, the UBI was actually very similar in a small sort of way to what I'm talking about in terms of a Jubilee, a cash flow that enables you to have positive equity in the private sector without having to work for it, which is the job guarantee thing. So I'd like to see that happen. And government's talking about it. If you actually said it was going to be a generous one, and you see it as creating part of a necessary aggregate demand for the corporate sector, rather than saying, oh, it's a terrible handout to people not working. To me, a lot of the debate I've seen on UBI, I think, is quite disappointing about how its attitude about humanity. So I would like to see the UBI brought in, but well above a poverty level, not the sort of thing that's been done with governments with a very neoliberal attitude, using it to reduce welfare payments even below what they are now. Understood.
Marcus, I think you make a great point. Marcus was involved in writing the white paper I referred to earlier. He was one of about 40 people who volunteered to do that. Marcus, we're going to be getting together another volunteer group to create a paper around the ideas that are being discussed tonight. And I love the point you made. Let's find out who the active supporters of universal basic income and see if there could be some kind of natural alliance with them. Folks, it's time for Professor Keane to get back to where he should be, which is tucked up in bed, because I think I'm right in saying it's about 2 o'clock in the morning where you are right now, Professor Keane. Can we all show our great appreciation to Professor Keane for his presentation tonight? He's made a huge effort to deliver it for us, and it was great. Thank you very much indeed. Wonderful.
And I'll just make a bit of plug for myself. Come to my Patreon page. 90% of my posts there are free access. I'd like that. And thank you to Steve and John and Ed and I can Shan the man down there, and the two Michaels. Great to see you all. It's been a nice, a lot of familiar faces. So I hope to see you again. Bye all.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to go straight now to Michael Hudson. I've never had the pleasure of having Michael with us before. It's wonderful that he's agreed to be here to follow up on Professor Keen's points. I'm aware that Michael thinks in a similar way and has thought in a similar way for many, 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 many years. And as I commented earlier, I spent a fair amount of time watching your various YouTube videos of various presentations and lectures you've given over the years in many different parts of the world. I'm truly, truly, truly flattered that you are with us here, Professor Michael Hudson. So can I please invite you to take yourself off mute? I can see you've already done that. Thank you so much. And please share with us your thoughts. And thank you again for being with us, Michael. Thank you.
It's good to be here. Steve Keen and I have gone around the world for 10 years doing our routine together. And the good thing is that I don't have to repeat what he said about banking and money, and I can more or less take off from there on policy. But I want to start with the first point that he made, that money is debt. Banks create money, but they create debt, but they also create debt for a particular purpose, to buy assets. When I went to school, I've been a professor for 50 years, but I didn't learn anything at all in the classes on money and banking that I had to take in the university. Everything I learned on working on Wall Street for the 10 years in my 20s. And the picture that I learned on Wall Street was a diametric opposite of everything that was taught in school. Of course, banks create money. In school, I was taught that the government flies over the economy with a helicopter and drops money, and people spend it on goods and services, and that's inflationary. I actually got only a C+ in money and banking for saying that the helicopter only flies over Wall Street, and it drops money over Wall Street, banks, and the banks make the loans to buy assets. And what you have is asset price inflation. And the only way that that affects consumer prices is when the assets increase the cost of access to housing, for instance. In America and England, 80% of bank loans are to the real estate sector. And of course, the more loans you have, the more housing prices go up, the access price goes up, and that's why Londoners can't afford to live in London anymore. They have to move outside. So on Steve's chart that he showed about the growth of debt and the growth of credit, you'll see the enormous takeoff in private debt after 1980. That was Margaret Thatcher's doing, and much of that was spent on privatization. The assets that were bought were privatized, and that vastly increased the cost of living and doing business. But there's another problem, and since we're talking about the coronavirus, I want to focus on what I'm saying on the virus. Debts do not only grow as a result of bank credit. Most debts grow as a result of something completely different, from accruals. They accrue at interest, and they accrue as arrears. And what you have had in the last 6 months in the United States, and I'm sure throughout Europe, is the large-scale unemployment here has prevented, we have 12 million unemployed. These unemployed do not have money to pay rents. They've fallen behind. If they are homeowners, they have not been able to pay the mortgage. And the expectation is that on January 3rd, just when the new president takes office, 5 million Americans will be thrown out on the street. That is what the financial sector is saying is needed to restore equilibrium. You cannot have equilibrium if you don't evict 5,000 people and foreclose. And for that reason, the stocks of the money management companies like Blackstone have been soaring. They've been soaring because they say, this is wonderful. 5 million Americans can't pay the mortgage. They will have a bonanza in buying underpriced properties that we can turn into rental properties. So here is how the situation will look in the United States. The Obama administration ended with 10 million Americans losing their homes as a result of the junk mortgage foreclosures. Homeownership rates in America fell from 69% to 63%. That's a huge difference. The Biden administration, sort of like Obama too, is going to lead to a similar large-scale decline in homeownership as a result of the inability to pay the evictions. Well, that's the problem that everyone is having to cope with. Steve made the second point was, do you pay for the Corona-19 virus like you pay for war? Well, I think that's a fault. I don't like that analogy. A real Jubilee is not paying, not bailing out the creditors. When Hammurabi canceled the debts, he canceled, he didn't make the creditors whole. His whole idea, well, the good thing about canceling debt is you cancel out savings too. I noted that the pension fund manager, you don't like to see savings cut out because that hurts the pension funds. And I have a solution to that. Don't worry, I'm all for preserving the value of pensions, and I intend to do that. But the problem is, do you want to reimburse the savers, the creditors, the 1%, let's say, that have got almost all of the wealth since the Obama depression began in 2009. All the wealth in American economy has gone to the 1%. The 99% has been absolutely flat. So you've had a huge disparity. Well, one of the reasons is that the money, the decline in interest rates, the quantitative easing has gone into the stock market. And Steve's model showed the connection between, a balance sheet, asset and debt. If you have a debt, well, you have an asset on the other side. But there's another problem here, and that's elasticity. The assets have grown much more than debts because of the, when you put a little bit of money into the market, especially when you buy on margin, it pushes the stock market way up and the real estate market way up. So real estate prices have soared, stock prices have soared, the creditors have done great, the debtors are in a bad way. Now, you can see something like Steve's solution actually was followed by President Trump in the CARES Act this spring. When all Americans were given $1,200 each. I got $1,200, my wife got $1,200, everybody got $1,200. Most of the money was paid into their bank accounts, and most of this $1,200 per person for the average person was used to pay down their debt. That's, in a way, what Steve was talking about. Well, of course they did, because it was paid to the credit card company. Your credit card balance and bank debt, your overdraft goes down. So of course it was to overpay the accruals that they'd run up. The problem is that none of this was used to revive the economy, to buy goods and services, and the economy's facing debt deflation right now, because if people have to pay the rents and the mortgages that have been falling into arrears in the last 6 months, they're not going to have much money to buy goods and services. So the question is, do you want to actually give people money to pay, give the debtors the money to pay the banks and to pay the landlords? That's not going to help revive the economy at all, but it'll make the banks and landlords continually rich, because any rate of interest is a doubling time. And the doubling time of the financial sector is much faster than the economy can grow. So what you're going to be doing by Steve's Jubilee is sort of continue kicking the can down the road and continuing the imbalance between the volume of debt and the ability to pay the debt. You'll be kicking down the road the debt deflation. Now, what does this have to do with pension funds? The problem is that England and American pension funds are different from Germany. They've been hooked into paying pensions in a way that you save in a financial system that, as Steve and I have mentioned, has become very dysfunctional. The financial system has not really been making loans to increase the means of production, to increase prosperity. It's been increasing debt, and it's been debt to buy assets that are already in place. Not to create new assets, not to make new factories, but to buy companies that produce things, and you increase the price of company stock. Much of it's used for takeover loans. In the last 10 years, many pension funds, because the rate of interest here on government bonds has fallen to 0.1%, pension funds have lent their money to private capital that's taken over companies, downsized them, break up value, doing all sorts of things that do not really help the economy. My ideal would be the German ideal. Pensions should be paid on a pay-as-you-go basis. That way, you don't have to financialize. You don't have to create a superstructure of debt and credit. I want to avoid that superstructure. Very simple. What Hammurabi's laws in 1750, the ruler of Babylon, had specific laws for what do you do when the population gets sick? And it was very simple. When a population gets sick, or when you have an act of God, and the act of God first occurs in Hammurabi's laws. When Adad, the storm god, will flood the land, then the rents and the debts and the taxes don't have to be paid. Because otherwise, what would happen? The debtors, the cultivators on the land, would fall into debt bondage to the creditors, who often were wealthy people in the palace bureaucracy. If they fell into debt to the creditors, they'd owe the crop surplus to the creditors instead of paying it to the palace. They'd owe their labor to the creditors instead of working at corvée labor building public works. They'd owe their labor to the creditors instead of fighting for the army. The way Babylon and every Near Eastern society before antiquity survived was by when there was a problem, you just suspend the debt payments, you spend the simple solution. Right now, the creditors are saying, well, a contract is a contract. We don't have Babylonian law. We have Roman law. And the Roman law says creditors come first. The creditors have to be paid. So I'm not in favor of making the 1% whole and increasing their exponential increase in claims on the 99%. But I do believe that pensions, very simple, the debts could be written down, and the government, of course, by collecting the, if the debt cancellation, the Jubilee went together with what the Babylonians had, the income coming, the taxes paid by the real estate or by the private sector, instead of tax, you would use the government revenue from the real estate rents that are now paid to the banking system. You'd use it for social spending headed by, of course, pensions would be there. You have to restructure and definancialize the pension fund system, but the definancialization goes hand in hand, not only with a monetary reform, but with a tax reform together. And together, you can do it. If you don't do that, then you're going to have these huge evictions in the United States. You're going to have Europe limping along with debt deflation because it hasn't been doing business. The belief in New York is that 90% of the restaurants cannot reopen because if they have not done business for 6 months and their rents have accrued without an income, well, you can imagine what is the point of staying in business if all your income for the next 5 years is to pay the back rent that for the money you didn't owe. They're going out of business. It is a disaster. So is it worth saving the wealth of the 1% by expropriating the 99% and closing them all? Who are you going to support? That obviously the 1% says, well, we make the laws, support us. We don't care. Well, the question is, do you care? And does your, do you who are dealing with what's an ideal financial sector, are you going to say somebody has to lose and the debts are not paid? Who is the least bad to lose? And sometimes to write down the volume of savings that only finds its counterpart in being lent out as debt, not in creating new capital, maybe that's not a bad thing either.
Wow. Wow, Professor Hudson, thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. Next time we organise a pensions event, I'd love to have you talking about this alternative way of definancialising the pension system. That sounds pretty interesting to me. Wonderful stuff. We really are being treated today, I'm sure everybody agrees, to very progressive thinking from our speakers. Thank you, Professor Hudson. We'll go to the group. Please do wave a hand if you'd like to say something at this point in time. Mr. Ed Tuhig, lovely to see you all the way from Canada, if I remember rightly. We've got folks today, by the way, from Canada, from the USA, from across Europe. It's truly from Poland. This really is an international feast of input today. Mr. Ed Tuhig, please do share with us your point. Thank you.
My hero, Michael Hudson, is finally here. If only Canada had listened to you 50 years ago, Michael, we would have been in much different shape than we are today. But the question I have for you is your opinion on the pension plan, the public pension plan of Canada, which has decided that it will invest its money into the public market and has invested 85% in foreign securities and the rest in Canadian securities. And that goes completely opposite to what you just told us. So would you comment on that pension plan, public pension plan of Canada, and what do you think it's going to do to us?
Well, I was the advisor to Canada, financial advisor to the Canada 40 years ago in 1977 when I wrote Canada in the New Monetary Order. The bank's lobbyists opposed everything I was saying. We're back to what they idealize as pension fund capitalism. The bank said pension funds are wonderful. They can push up the stock market as long as their retirees pay in, and we smart boys will ride the free ride of all the pension funds buying the stocks, pushing up the stocks, and then just before the Canadian population ages and begin to withdraw more than they put in, we'll sell out and we'll let the pensioners hold the bag. The stock market plunges as there's no more pension money going in because pensions begin to pay out by selling off the stocks and creating a down thing. So their hope is to make money until the crash and then bail out quickly, leaving the Canadians broke. That's the banking plan. And that's pretty much always been the banking plan in every society, how to make so much money that you leave the rest of the economy broke. That's banking 101. And yet that wasn't taught in the school when I went to school. And it's amazing the different perspective you have working in a bank as opposed to going to academic economic class.
What a great question from Ed, and what a wonderful answer. That's really interesting. That's scary, scary stuff. I wonder if that might be a pattern we see in other parts of the world. Seriously scary stuff. Anybody else would like to wave a hand and make a point? Wow, really, really great input. We're going to have a 5-minute break now, folks. It's just coming up to 20 past the hour. We'll reconvene at 25 past the hour. When we get back, we've got Professor Richard Wilkinson talking about the, if you like, the human dimension to inequality in the system. That's going to be very, very interesting indeed, I assure you. And then we've got Marie Storley, Ian Veach, Steve Hubbard, Shan Turnbull, Anne-Marie Borg, and hopefully a bit of general chit chat after that. So she's got a lot more to get through. Can we please show our genuine, deep appreciation to Professor Michael Hudson for sharing his time and his ideas with us today. Thank you very much indeed, Michael. Super stuff, absolutely super stuff. We're going to do something with this. It's not just going to be idle chatter. We'll turn it into a paper. We'll do something with the paper and we'll try to get traction amongst people that matters. Please do reconvene at 25 past the hour. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, so far. Great stuff, Michael. Please do stick around if you can. And I'd love to have you speaking at one of our pensions events coming up, because there is a real concern I have that if the financialization of the pension system has potential risks attached to it, people need to know what those potential risks are. Thank you very much, Michael. Okay, folks, we'll get the show back on the road, as it were. I think we've been treated to 2 exceptionally good presentations and talks so far. We're now going to have Professor Richard Wilkinson talking about equality. Equality is very relevant to the subject we're dealing with tonight because of the profound inequality that could occur as a result of the COVID crisis becoming a financial crisis. So I would invite Professor Richard Wilkinson, to share the next 5-10 minutes or so with his thoughts. We'll then have a quick Q&A, and then we'll go on to short presentations from Marie Storley, Ian Veach, Steve Hubbard, Shan Turnbull, and Anne-Marie Borg. We are scheduled to finish in 35 minutes. However, we will have what we call our fireside chat afterwards, whereby we'll just keep the channel open and we can have some informal, unstructured, unfacilitated chit chat amongst those who want to carry on chatting afterwards. Apart from anything else, it's often very good for networking. I hope everybody's okay. I hope you're all enjoying this. I certainly am. Professor Wilkinson, please share your thoughts, and thank you very much for being with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me, though listening, I'm very unsure of why you invited me. I feel I've walked into a lion's den. I'm an epidemiologist, and so I'm almost entirely ignorant of the sort of things you've been talking about, but just a little I've heard. I'm excited by it. I want to show you a few slides taken from our work on the effects of inequality, the social effects of inequality, that started off really trying to understand health inequalities, the big differences in death rates between social classes, and then spread more widely to understanding the broader impact of economic inequalities. So I'm going to share my screen. I hope. Yes. So I hope you can now see my screen. The first thing I want to say is that really looking at income inequality and showing the range of things that it does to our societies, how it causes all sorts of forms of social dysfunction, that are now very well established in the academic journals. I mean, there's literally hundreds of peer-reviewed papers, as I say, started looking at health differences within the population and then spread to other issues. That income inequality is not something separate from what we've all known about class and status. What income inequality does is make class and status more important, makes it more powerful. In effect, bigger material differences between us increase the social distances between us. That really we're talking about whether we have a society that is a very steep social pyramid like that, or a much shallower one like that. And it changes the quality of social relations in all sorts of ways. I mean, you see that there's less social mobility in societies with bigger income gaps between rich and poor. There are fewer interclass marriages. All sorts of things show the stronger effects, divisive effects of class and status. One of the things that we did was put together an index of all these things listed on the left of the screen internationally, and related to measures of income inequality for those countries. Downloaded, well, they were the same on the World Bank website when we were doing this work as on the UN Human Development Report. What you're seeing there is that with bad outcomes, worse outcomes, always scoring higher, so reverse scoring some of these things, poorer performances on all those kinds of issues in the more unequal societies. In the rich developed world, the USA, Portugal, UK were the most unequal when we were doing this work. we were afraid people would think that we had just picked problems to suit our argument. So we also looked at the UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing, which we had no hand in compiling, and it shows exactly the same pattern. The only difference is here that the worse outcomes are scored lower, so the slope is negative. The UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing contains about 40 components. So whether kids can talk to their parents, whether there's bullying in schools, whether there's a lot of drug addiction, how they do in these international maths and literacy tests that OECD organizes, all that kind of thing goes into this. And you see, just like our index on the last slide, it shows worse outcomes as averages for whole national populations in societies with the bigger income differences. The individual components of the index are also related to inequality. We did a paper in the British Medical Journal and another in Pediatrics showing the analysis of individual components. And there's more and more work of this kind. This is, you've probably heard of the lost wallet experiments, where wallets are picked up and they look to see how many are returned. And you see in the more unequal societies on the right, about, what, 20% are returned, but in the more equal ones on the left, it's about 80% get returned. Really big differences. That goes also with differences in trust. By the way, we did this, our international comparisons, we've repeated them on the 50 states of the USA as a sort of separate test bed, and found that you get almost exactly the same results. The more unequal American states do worse on just the same things as we found internationally. I would like closer to an hour to tell you about this work. I've only got 10 minutes. This is just another example. The proportion of the population in prison in different countries. Up the side, you've got a log scale, and you've got sort of 10 or 12-fold differences in the proportion of the population locked up. Mainly, well, it's partly more crime, but most of it is more punitive sentencing in more unequal societies. So, you know, I could show you dozens of these things. I think this is the last of the ones I'm going to show you. It's an important graph because it shows that social mobility is lower. I think many people think that big inequalities of outcome are fair if everyone can find their right position in society. The idea, if you work hard, you move up, and if you don't, you move down. But what this shows is it's intergenerational income mobility. So it's basically saying that rich parents have rich children and poor parents have poor children in more unequal societies, and that in the more equal ones, parents' income is much less important. I said at the beginning when I was showing you those pyramids that class and status become more important. And one of the effects of this is that we all become more worried about how we're seen and judged. We judge each other's worth by status, but that means we also become more worried about how we are seen and judged. You know, whether people think you're clever, successful, all the rest of it. And there are now papers which show that in more unequal countries, all income groups have higher levels of status anxiety. You see the horizontal axis is not inequality, it's the different deciles of the income distribution. And all deciles, that top line, have higher status anxiety in more unequal countries. And that changes our behavior. It basically means we're more concerned about self-presentation. And one of the things that feeds into, amongst other, it feeds into insecurities about self-worth, it feeds into mental illness, all sorts of things. So I thought you might be interested to see how it feeds into consumerism. The most obvious way in which we try and present ourselves as successful, higher status and so on, is by spending money on status goods. And there are now a number of papers that show in more unequal status societies, we spend more money on status goods. You also see in one of the best researched issues in relation to inequality is violence, as measured by homicide rates, much higher homicide rates in more unequal societies. Because homicide seems to be triggered so often by people feeling looked down on, loss of face, humiliation, those kinds of things. It's been often quite small events trigger a violent response. So lots of evidence that inequality leads to higher levels of violence. I thought this meeting would be particularly interested in this, but I do feel that people will probably have quite different interpretations of this. I see it, this is US data. It's had the ups and downs of the business cycle smoothed out of it. Of course, as we've already seen, the rise in inequality in the earlier part of the 20th century was followed by a rise in debt. I do think that is to a substantial extent people trying to keep up expenditure, keep up with others. Anyway, I thought I'd just show you that small collection of things. I think that's my last slide. No, it isn't. So yeah, it's making that same point that I started with. But I think the overall picture is that for years we have thought that inequality only matters if it creates absolute poverty. But what we have an evolved sensitivity to is social status, position in relation to each other. You know, I get really angry if you pretend you're better than I am. I say, who the hell do you think you are? You know, those sort of things create responses. And so that a more accurate view of inequality is that it's about social position, it's about relative income. It's about dominance and subordination, superiority and inferiority, which of course has come up so much recently with Black Lives Matter and so on, people's sensitivity to those issues. And that's really what we're dealing with. I'm sorry not to have another half hour. I could really give you the picture, but I'll have to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Professor Wilkinson. It's great of you to spend time with us today, sharing your thoughts and ideas. That was crystal clear. That really was crystal clear. And just to make sure everybody understands the connection between the private debt Jubilee idea and what Professor Wilkinson has been talking about, the connection is this. If we don't have some strategy for dealing with, coping with, sorting out, mitigating the consequences of the financial crisis that may well occur as a consequence of the COVID crisis, we will find ourselves thrown into, most likely, even more inequality than we have now. And what Professor Richard Wilkinson has articulated is that inequality is bad for the entire system, not just those unfortunate folk who find themselves at the bottom end of the ladder. Let me put it that way, in using those terms. We're going to go to questions and comments in a moment. Before I do, there's a couple of things I'd like to share with you. So first of all, I'm going to share with you this page. This is the YouTube video I watched of a documentary called Four Horsemen. Professor Wilkinson is one of the people in that documentary. You may not agree with everything in it. I'd be surprised if you did, but there is definitely a lot of really good stuff in there if what you're into is the sorting out of the financial system and greater equality, greater prosperity for all. It's a 2012 British documentary by Ross Ashcroft. I spoke to Ross at length the other day. We had a lovely conversation. And as the notes here says, it criticizes the fractional reserve banking system, the debt-based economy, political lobbying by banks, etc., etc. I know that many of you will really enjoy that. If you haven't watched it before, it's available on YouTube. I'll put the link into the chat. And the second thing I'm going to share with you before I go to questions for Professor Wilkinson to respond to is just a reminder for those of you that have not yet become a subscription member, please do so. It makes complete sense. You can come to all the TTF events for free once you become a subscription member. There are 4 options. There's the annual option payment, the quarterly payment option, the monthly payment option, and very, very importantly, and I'm proud of this, very importantly, there's a 4th option where if you can't afford options 1, 2, or 3, you go for the 4th option, and the 4th option does not have a minimum to it at all. Yeah, we are literally getting subscription members who are paying £1 a month, and I'm absolutely fine with that. We're not doing this to make money, we're doing this to create a worldwide movement for change. So one way or another, please all become a subscription member. That way we can help to build this community as quickly and as effectively as we want to. I'll follow up individually with everybody that doesn't yet have a subscription membership, and quite literally everybody can afford to become a subscription member regardless of your financial position, and that is very much in keeping with the TTF philosophy. Okay, I hope that all makes crystal clear sense. I will remember to put the link to the film documentary in the chat shortly. Before I do, please wave if you'd like to make a comment following up from what we've just heard. I'm wondering, for example, if Debbie Henderson might see a correlation in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the many various things we've been talking about with our financial services leaders. Debbie, any thoughts in responding to Richard Wilkinson? I know you weren't expecting me to say this, but I was thinking about you all the way through Professor Wilkinson's talk. Debbie, if anything, what would you like to say?
Thank you, Andy, and thank you very much, Professor Wilkinson. I watched your YouTube clips and so many of your presentations earlier. And this time, what I became particularly interested in, linking it to our debt jubilee question and what's happening. Let's start with the US, because that's the one that's the outlier in most of your slides on the income inequality basis. What happens when we start looking at this level of debt rising, indicating as well the levels of income inequality, and therefore all of the elements of showing up of social ills? Do you see this leading us to civil unrest? And if so, what other examples have you got, or what's going to be the instigator for that? Have we seen it in other countries where you've compared it? At what point in time do we start to say where people are saying enough already? That we need to sort of bring the inner violence outside in some way.
There are a couple of papers that look at the relationship between inequality and various forms of civil strife, political assassinations, demonstrations, all that kind of thing. There seems to be a weak relationship. I don't think it's a strong one. And of course, we know that there have been awful tyrannies that have survived for hundreds of years. I don't think there's an automatic response, but I guess it depends very much on all sorts of other things that have changed since the historical record. You know, we're not societies like we were a century or so ago, where this data is often collected from. So I think it is very difficult to predict. I think that if we have large-scale unemployment, if there are not adequate systems of benefits and so on, then I would expect a lot of conflict.
Thank you very much.
Basically, I'm guessing in just the same way that you would.
Thank you very much indeed for your question, Debbie, and your response, Professor Wilkinson. Would anybody else like to make a point at this stage? Just raise your hand, wave about if you do. Mr. Ed Toohig, once again, lovely to have you make a point. Ed, go for it.
In Nova Scotia, we have inequalities with both our Indigenous people and our Black communities. And what has happened and what has increased the society upset here has been that the government has been fighting it almost entirely on a money basis. And as such, they have created some terrible conflicts between our fishing industry and our Indigenous right to a fair basis of life. And it's been a complete bollocks because they have passed legislation and regulations and so on without coordinating the social aspects of it. And it's you just can't throw money at this kind of inequality. There are other factors that come into it, but it's an interesting study in equality and how not to try to solve it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed.
Any other comments before we pass back to Professor Wilkinson for his final words before we move on to the next part of our program today? Ian Veach, please do share your thought. Lovely to have you with us, Ian.
Yeah, could I mean, thank you. I thought it was a brilliant presentation, but you know, I mean, I'm going back to, I'm an actuary, so I'm going back to almost when I was at university. You always sort of learned that socioeconomic class as a good indication of, you know, as a good indication of inequality was always a key driver for most mortality and morbidity figures. But there was always a sense of, with social mobility, you know, people with the right support could move and their outcomes changed with that. But since then, I think you've seen the increase in debt, particularly in student debt, as what, you know, with education as a key driver. You know, of the measures of social mobility, you know, is there anyone who's actually managing to maintain social mobility or increase it, or is it really decreasing everywhere? And is debt one of the issues that's really preventing people moving to maybe a better outcome?
We, I think, put the first data together on social mobility and inequality. There have been 2 or 3 more papers since then, but the effect of inequality seems almost universal. I don't see any clear outliers who buck the trend. And it is, and people have intuited that inequality was divisive and socially corrosive for centuries, you know, since before the French Revolution. And that's, in a way, all the data shows. Now we can actually compare amounts of inequality in different countries. We know that that intuition is truer than we ever expected. But I think the effect on social mobility is a fairly central effect, in that it shows the ossification of the status and class system, the bigger it gets. I mean, basically, parents find ways of passing on their advantages and disadvantages to their children. And the bigger those advantages and disadvantages are, the more it ossifies the system of social mobility. I think also downward prejudices probably increase with inequality, prejudices against ethnic minorities and so on. And one of the ways in which all this relates to health is that we now understand that the effects of chronic stress are fundamentally important in health. They lead to something that looks very like more rapid aging, affecting the immune system, the cardiovascular system, wound healing, digestion, all sorts of outcomes. So chronic stress from things like the stressful effects of inequality on social relations, your worries about, you know, everyone thinks I'm unattractive, boring, stupid, you know, those kinds of insecurities. Those are the ones I think that are amongst the most powerful at the population level, sources of chronic stress driving those health differences.
I have to make one quick comment here. I watched a program a couple of weeks ago with my wife and kids about the impact of social media on the self-esteem of youngsters. It's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. You're talking about people worrying about, you know, how they see themselves compared to their peer group and all these sorts of things. Gosh, I think we've got a bit of a can of worms there that needs sorting out.
I tweeted actually a graph that's in one of our earlier books, I think the Spirit Level, earlier today, showing huge differences in the frequency of bullying in schools in different countries, because of course inequality is about being I'm better than you. And I think there are evolved responses to it, which lead to increased bullying in school and that sort of status competition. And there was some other point I was going to make in relation to what you said, but I've lost it.
No problem at all. I'd like to thank you very much indeed, Professor Wilkinson, for sharing your knowledge, insight, experience, expertise with us this evening. You've taken us into new territory for TTF. It was a very kind of human dimension to the consequences of having a system that is not a meritocracy, and one where it's not just about people's abilities being a determinant of what happens to them in life. So many other factors have the same effect. And I want to repeat my point. This connects to the whole topic of a private debt jubilee, because if we do end up having a financial crisis as a consequence of the COVID crisis, we have to ask ourselves, can we predict that happening? And if we can, what are going to be the mitigating strategies to avoid the worst case scenarios that are quite easy to imagine? Professor Wilkinson, thank you very much. Can we all please show our appreciation? Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Great stuff. Really great stuff. We're pretty much exactly where we ought to be timing wise, which is a bit unusual. So thank you all for being so willing to keep us to track. We're going to go to Ian Veach, who's got one of our Just a Minute rounds. Our Just a Minute rounds are inspired by the BBC Radio 4 programs where the speakers have just a minute to share their thoughts. On the radio program, they're not allowed to repeat themselves, deviate or hesitate. We won't be that strict. But Mr. Ian Veach, say whatever you like, however you want to say it, so long as you can get it said in a minute. Go for it, sir.
Get the stopwatch on. But yes, firstly, thank you to everyone. I do feel a bit of a fraud. I think we've got some great academic speakers who have thought about these topics for a long time. I have to admit, you know, took me back to my 5th and 6th year economics at school, probably the last time I thought heavily about this before I went off into the insurance industry. But I do remember two things. I remember in 6th year having a really good economics teacher who explained how he thought the banking system worked. And that was, I think, a major realization that, you know, the entire system was itself, at that point many years ago, flawed or definitely changeable. And the other key message, it always was, it was society should decide what financial system it wants, as opposed to financial systems deciding what society should want. And that's one thing that's always stayed with me. Probably takes you through sort of more radical politics when you're a student, but moderate, and I suspect I'm becoming a bit more radical again. I think some of the ideas are really great here. I mean, I think, you know, as I said, we probably lost the 2008 crisis by not getting substantial change, possibly because that was actually quite different in different markets. I think COVID, you know, if there's any positive, it's hitting everyone in a similar way, which probably allows society a bit to regroup. I was very taken, I must say, I'd never heard the phrase debt jubilee, so I did Google, and I think, you know, I'm not as historically advanced as people who've studied this for some time, but, you know, it was also important, you know, this wasn't done out of charity, this was done out of a need to balance society, and balancing society helps not everyone, but particularly the wealthy, you know, so it wasn't charitable from the top. And I think, you know, the comments earlier about, yeah, probably the 1% do need to pay, but, you know, payment is for a balanced society, payment is for a rebased society, and payment is ensuring that the majority of it knocking on the gates, you know, trying to take your money back forcibly. I think one thing we didn't discuss tonight is obviously useful. Almost if you get a great rebasing, you know, the future then of what financial education and particularly understanding the benefits and constraints of debt, particularly at a personal level, is really important. My years in financial services shows financial literacy is horrible. And out of that, I think a large part of our debt problems, particularly at an individual level, are people walking into the middle of the minefield and then not realizing we're there and not realizing how to get out. So I'd make a big call out for financial literacy once you've actually solved the basic problem, to make sure we don't get back into that one.
And thank you very much indeed. You may have gone over your 1 minute there, but
yeah,
the content was great. Thank you very much indeed, Ian. Mr. Steve Hubbard, same thing. You can deviate, hesitate, and go off track if you want to. In fact, you can say whatever you like. So
okay.
As long as you keep it within 1 minute, please, Steve. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Two points, really. First of all, is to thank the speakers. I mean, the three lead speakers have been really terrific, and yourself also for pulling it together. The second point is that it has combined the economic side of Steve Keen, shall we say, with almost Michael Hudson in the middle, and I think and Professor Richard Wilkinson at the end with the social side. And that to me is a big advance, and it's a really important issue. And it shows that economics is not as sort of as dissociated from these things as some people think. And, you know, I would repeat and support Ian's point earlier about education and the public education being so important, and an understanding of that. The social side, I'm reading some stuff and made contact with John Comelos at the moment, who some people here may know, but he is very much on the social side. But economics and sociology are intimately linked, I think. The crisis we speak of, it may well be COVID. We may get over that, or it may be the environment. I know Steve Keen has done a lot of work on the environment and linked that to economics as well. So there's a sort of I think we're under a bit of a shadow at the moment with COVID and short term almost, and environment long term. So these issues, I think, are absolutely vital, and so it's a pleasure to have been present when we've had so many powerful comments and powerful thoughts. Thank you.
Steve, there you are thanking us and thanking the session. In fact, we owe you a debt of gratitude. Forgive the unintended pun on debt there, because it was through Steve Hubbard that we got to know about Steve Keen. Through Steve Keen that we got to Michael Hudson. It's just ripples in the pond that, as a consequence of you throwing a pebble into it a little while ago, Steve. So thank you very much for your contribution in making what we've just done tonight possible. Thank you very much indeed. Good. Our last Just a Minute round, sorry, our second to last Just a Minute round goes to Shan Turnbull, who's on the other side of the world from us here in the UK. So Shan, please tell everybody who you are, where you are, and share your point. Thank you very much.
Andy, I'm in Sydney, Australia. It's early morning here, and I think you've got a great group of people that I've had conversations with privately. It's a terrific session. And a summary of what I want to say is in the chat. And the summary is that I'm a decentralized banker, like Richard Werner and Steve Keen was doing. Steve Keen has shown just how complicated the financial system is, and we need a decentralized system, and that means no central banking, but a special form of central planning. We know that doesn't work, and money's too complicated. It does too many roles. We need to simplify money so it automatically expires, where you don't create debt. And that can be done decentralized and solve the COVID problem. And before I became governor, Mervyn King in 1999 said that central banking is just a passing phase. It may not exist in the future. And I think that's where we want to be. And we've got a plan for that when the system breaks down. And my stopwatch says now it's exactly 60 seconds. It's a minute.
Thank you, Dan. It is wonderful for you to get up at whatever it was, 4 o'clock in the morning when it started, for you being with us this evening. Really appreciate your participation as always from the other side of the world, and please do Give my regards to Pauline. Anne-Marie Borg, it's lovely that we're finishing with Anne-Marie, because Anne-Marie's got such a human perspective on everything. Anne-Marie, please.
Oh, kind of, I'm at it again, I'm afraid. But to pick up on what Sean just said, and also on your introduction, I find it extremely interesting that where we are at the moment, which is a very painful place, but we have realized how important people are. And we see that in our local communities, and how the communities have got together to actually bring finances together, to help people, to bring health together, to bring all sorts of things together, which made me think about, of course, is there any mileage in looking at the 70s and what was actually researched by Ernest Friedrich Schumacher, who was researching how small is beautiful in a system where people really mattered. I think it just goes with our times, and I think there is mileage there, and I'd be very interested in knowing how people feel about it, because I see it locally, how it actually is going. In other words, can we look at this decentralization with less risk of abuse of a certain system, and also more transparency and accountability?
Thank you. Voila once again. Voila once again. Superb stuff. Okay, folks, quite miraculously, it's exactly 8 o'clock UK, top of the hour. We've somehow managed to land it on the square meter, as they would say in the paratroopers. Brilliant stuff. Now, for those of you that don't know, we will now be formally closing the session, but we'll keep the channel open. I expect the vast majority of you to disappear and spend the rest of your day or evening doing whatever you want to. For those that want to stick around and chat, we'll start that in just 2 or 3 minutes. I'm going to go and get myself a wee dram of something and be back in 2 or 3 minutes. It's been a wonderful session. We've had Professor Steve Keen, Professor Michael Hudson, Professor Richard Wilkinson. We've quite literally had world-class speakers and thinkers on topics that are extremely important right now. What else can I say? What else can I say? This is important stuff we're debating. We're not just chewing the cud. We're talking about really important matters. Thank you all very, very much indeed.